Hello, welcome to another edition of Dr. Bickmore's YA Wednesday interviews. And my guest this week is somebody that many of you might know. It's Chris Crowe. He's a professor at Brigham Young University and perhaps certainly within the world of Allen and young adult literature. I see Chris as one of the experts, especially in the field of African American literature and its history, as well as history of the studies of young adult literature. So welcome, Chris. In case people don't know your track record for publishing is in the young adult world, clearly you're an academic with lots of years experience and a gifted teacher. But the books that most people might know you by or should know you by is first Mississippi Trial 1955, which is a fictional work surrounding the events of the murder of Emmett Till. And then combined with that, one of the things that you did is also wrote a nonfiction piece called Getting Away with Murder. And maybe you could talk about a little bit about the generation of those two books, how you came to be sensitive to that issue, and what your history around that topic has been.
Sure. So, and it's been a long time. I think Mississippi Trial came out in 2002, so it's got some years on it. So I've always loved history. I like research better than I like writing, so it's always fun to dig into stuff. It's easier. And anyway, I was working on a Twain biography of Mildred D. Taylor. And I signed a contract, and there's lots of things you promise, including photos from her family and that kind of stuff. And anyway, I naively signed it, and then discovered that Mildred doesn't do interviews, and they wouldn't even give me her phone number. She didn't do email. It was just this good luck. And even her publisher, when I contacted them, said, "We'd love you to do this book, but she won't talk. She's not going to talk to you." So I thought, okay, I better see what's out there, and any researcher knows when you start seeing the same sources, you've hit bottom, right? When everywhere you look, the same thing. And so that's what I'd found pretty much with Mildred after just a few days of work. The family stories, that kind of stuff, but she'd really been carefully managing her presence in print. Not because she's a freak of privacy or a recluse, or she's very social, but she likes to have her privacy, and she's a very personal person. So she feels awkward when someone acts as if they know her when she doesn't know them, like at a book signing or something. So, I mean, at the Newbery acceptance speech, the Newbery dinner, her publishers had to go to her hotel room and take her physically to the lecture hall. So I had to start looking for every kind of scrap source, every sideways source, articles, letters, speeches. I didn't know what I'd find. And I found an essay that she had written. It was published, I don't remember where, it was a long time ago. But she was talking about her family had moved from Mississippi to Toledo, Ohio in the 40s. And so in 1955, in this essay, she was talking about being nervous about starting high school because of Brown versus Board. So in Toledo, she would be among the first Black kids to go to the high school there, Scott High School. And so that made her nervous. And then as a really great student, she was nervous, can I compete? So she was worried about just academically, could she do it? And then she said, and I was also worried for my life because a kid my age was murdered in Mississippi that summer. And I had no idea who she was talking about. I thought, by then I knew that almost all of her novels are based on family stories, family relatives. So I thought I better run this down just to make sure there's not a minor character or something that I just don't know about. And that's when I first saw that corpse photograph, the coffin photo of Emmett Till from his viewing in Chicago. And I was just stunned. For the horrific nature of the crime was one thing, but the absence of that in my historical experience was terrifying, is not the right word. Embarrassing, maybe is the right word. That how could I not have known this? Because it was such a big deal in the 50s, and for African Americans, it's always been a big deal. Everybody knew that story. So I thought, okay, I better, I'm going to have to put this away and finish this Taylor book. And she eventually did agree to talk to me, and she's actually a wonderful person and very friendly, and sent me tons of family photos and read the manuscript and all that kind of stuff. So when I was done with that book and went back to the Till case, I was just thinking the novelist's first decision, one of the first decisions, is who's going to tell the story. And I'd done a lot more research by then, but just doing historical stuff on African American history and Mississippi history and racism in the United States and the history of imprisoned slaves coming in the 1600s. All I did all that stuff just because obviously I had big gaps to fill in my knowledge base. So then the decision, who's going to tell the story? And my first impulse was, well, one of his cousins, because there've been several kids who were there at the store when he whistled at Carolyn Bryant, and that would make it much more personal. But even before I actually tried to even write a page or two, I realized, thinking about it, there's no amount of research that would help me get this right, that would authentically put me in the mind of a kid, African-American kid in Mississippi, who'd been there his whole life, living through this tragedy. So then I thought, well, then I'm stuck with myself. So the viewpoint character was basically me in high school, that I was in high school in the 70s in Tempe, Arizona, and I had a lot of Latino friends, Mexican-American friends, but I assumed their lives just like mine. I was not naive. And honestly, I just figured what Ruben Reyes does, I can, we're all the same brothers, on the football team, we were brothers. And obviously, when I got older, I realized, no, Ruben's life when he left school was nothing like the life I had when I left school. And the things I could do and say in school were different than things he could say and do. So anyway, I thought a viewpoint character in a coming of age novel, someone has to come of age, has to learn something they didn't know. And so I thought taking a white kid who was benignly naive or oblivious or something in high school, who being confronted with these awful facts would have to have a change, a knowledge change, a change of heart, a new awareness or something. So yeah, then I wrote that. The hard thing was keeping the historical information straight. My deal was I wasn't going to alter any historical facts in the historical novel.
Yeah, the novel is it's a fantastic read, and I'll tell you where I bought the first copy was in the Strand bookstore in New York City. I was on a trip with my daughter Abby, who's one of your avid fans, and I said, "Oh, look, here's a book by Chris Crowe that she'd met you casually somewhere before that." And she said, "Well, let's buy that." And I said, "Okay." So we bought that, and I think I'd read it before, but then I bought that copy and gave it to Abby. How did you come to write the nonfiction piece? Did you just decided you had so much information, or?
Well, that was part of it. I mean, I had a couple of boxes because when you do historical, at least for me, when I do historical research for fiction, I have to go way beyond the boundaries of the story itself, because there's foundational stuff and sometimes things just didn't get carried through that should have been. And anyway, I'm a box guy. I find stuff and throw it in a box. I don't file it or take notes, or I just make copies and stack them up. So I had 2 boxes full of stuff, and I was a little bit worried that, because part of the racist defense down there was that body ain't Emmett Till, that there was no murder. And so I worried a little bit about historical fiction with Emmett Till as a part of that story, reinforcing that racist defense that, well, see, it's fiction, right? So Crowe's perpetuating the story that there's this kid named Emmett Till, but there really was no such, or whatever,
Yeah.
So there's a practical nature to it that, as a student, where you think, I'm going to use the same paper for 2 classes. I've already done the work. I can just flip it over. And that was my thinking, was I've got this stuff, and the stuff you can't ignore, these photographs, and not just the coffin photo, but just so many photos, and Emmett's mother, all this stuff. So, but my editor had never done a nonfiction book, so she was very much something more than lukewarm about it, much or less than lukewarm. She wasn't very enthusiastic about it, and but she had been an activist in the 60s as a young woman. She had marched, She cared about the story. I mean, obviously she accepted the novel. So my agent kind of worked on her, and so she agreed to do a nonfiction book, but she was sure, she was certain. She said this is never going to sell. We'll never sell any of these. And I, my naive thinking of saying paper for 2 classes was totally not even close, because the demand of documentation was so much higher. I had to, for the final manuscript, I had to give them an annotated manuscript with footnotes on every source I used, anything that came from source, either paraphrase or quotation. But then I had to give them a photocopy of that source, of that page, of that document, whatever. And which is a good thing, to be held accountable like that. But so anyway, so that was my goal, was to write it, to tell the story straight, right? To make it a documentary style account, use these images from the past, from the 60s and 50s, in the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, to get that included. I can tell another story about that if you got a minute.
English teacher and a social studies teacher, if they're talking about that time period, which for a lot of us of a certain age, it predates the movement of the 60s, right? But it certainly is a foreshadowing event in most African American communities in a way that white communities kind of gloss over, right? So yeah, I think it's really important, and a really good opportunity for English teachers to see how social studies and English are indeed meshed, and we could do more cooperation with our colleagues in social studies.
I think there was a video, Eyes on the Prize, had a little segment on Emmett Till from the 1980s, and that was maybe the only documentary I could find visual. But I knew I wanted to have a chapter on Emmett, just as Emmett, a kid, not as a martyr, not as a historical figure, but just what was he like as a kid. And I knew the only source was his mom, that she would know, she would tell me. But I knew that from what I'd been reading in my own research, I knew that she was kind of working on her own memoir, and I knew what right do I have to tell her story, or her son's story. So and there are probably other anxieties, talking to someone who knew Martin Luther King Jr. I don't know what. So at night I would come home from work, and my wife said, "How did it go today?" And I'd tell her my research, and I'd say, "But I really need to talk to Emmett's mom, but I'm afraid to talk to Emmett's mom." And because of all these anxieties, maybe she'll sue me, all this stuff. And so after a few weeks of me whining, I need to talk to Emmett's mom, but I'm afraid to call her, Liz calls me at work one day, and she goes, "Guess who I just talked to?" And I said, "I don't know who." And she said, "Emmett's mother." And I'm like, "What?" she tracked me down. "Oh no, what's wrong?" She said, "No, I was so tired of your whining, I looked up her number and called her myself. She's waiting for you to call right now. Here's her number. Goodbye." And she hung up on me. And so I had to call her, and it was such a great experience. I mean, she had just come home from the hospital. She was being treated for diabetes, and her health was really pretty crummy. But she said, "I'd love to have you come to my apartment," because she had been saving stuff for years, and it was middle of the semester, we couldn't go, but we did 2 long phone interviews, and she was so gracious and generous, and she was especially supportive of anybody. She'd spent her life trying to make sure her son wasn't forgotten, and so anybody who was trying to tell that story, she was supportive behind the project. So I was doing that nonfiction book at the same time Stanley Nelson was doing a documentary for PBS that aired on Martin Luther King Day a few weeks after his mother died. And it was actually at Sundance Film Festival here in Utah before the PBS premiere. And then there was a guy down in Alabama who's doing a book called Documentary Narrative of the Emmett Till Case, a guy named Chris Metras. We were simultaneously using these same sources and ignorant of each other until these projects all came out within 6 months of each other. So it was, sometimes students will say, "So you're the one who got this Emmett Till stuff started, right? With the film, recent film and stuff like that." No, when you write for kids, you don't start anything. But it was time. It was like the zeitgeist. I don't know what made Stanley Nelson start thinking about making a film, or Chris Meach start collecting documents, but it was time for that story to be embraced in the wider culture. And not because of anything I did, but it was just time.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth to that. Well, this is a great resource opportunity that I think, with the release of the new kind of popular film and other things, I hope some people take occasion to look at all these resources again and use them in the classroom. Well, a shift that I would like you to talk a little bit about, for 10 or 15 minutes is Death Coming Up the Hill is, in my opinion, one of the best accounts of the Vietnam War written for adolescents that you can find. I know a lot of schools use short stories by Tim O'Brien, from The Things They Carried, who I think Tim O'Brien is a great chronicler of that event as well. But Death Coming Up the Hill, for people who don't know, is a novel written in verse. And I'm going to let you explain the verse and the scope, because it's a tour de force in probably stick-to-itiveness on your part, the ability to write it.
I was casting about for my next novel project. I really do like historical fiction, but I realized too that when I'm working on a nonfiction project, I always think, man, I wish I was writing a novel right now because it's easier. And when I'm writing a novel, I'm wishing I'm writing nonfiction because that's easier. So it's just not easy for me. And I was kind of zeroed in on the 60s because the Till case really made me read into the 60s. And even when his mom told me that his favorite baseball player was Minnie Minoso, who played for the Cubs, no, the White Sox. And I thought I better look that up, what's going on. And I encountered this guy named Larry Doby, who'd just been traded to the White Sox, and I'd never heard of him. Of course, there's so many things I haven't heard of. And so I wrote a children's book about Larry Doby. But so Emmett Till really connected with so much stuff. Thurgood Marshall, that he's the intersection of civil rights stuff. So the 60s was just a wild time. And a few years before I started that novel, Gary Schmidt came to our campus and visited my young adult classes, and we were talking. He loves history, and I can't remember how the Vietnam War came up, but he said, 1968 was the worst year in Vietnam. And I thought, I didn't know, and they went on to talk something else. And so when I started tracking the 60s, 68 really was like I don't know if it's the pinnacle or the trench or something, but it was the most dynamic, cataclysmic sort of a year. And there are several books just called 1968 and a couple of documentaries, and even in the study of the Vietnam War, 68 is the spike. So Schmidt was right. In 68, if you took all the soldiers' deaths of American soldiers in all the years we were in Vietnam up before 68 and totaled them, it still doesn't equal, or after 68, wouldn't equal how many guys died in 68, 16,592. But then, Martin Luther King's murder, Bobby Kennedy's murder, assassinations both, campus unrest, race riots after Martin Luther King was murdered, the black protest in Mexico City Olympics in 68, those two guys, Thomas Smith and John Carlos, who raised a fist, Jabbar, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who was the little senator at the time, refused to play in the U.S. Olympic team because he said, why would I represent a country that doesn't represent me? Best basketball player in the world refused to play. And so there's lots of tension. Even Miss America, that was when the women's movement really kind of got a foothold, where they protested being kind of treated like cattle instead of their talent and intelligence. So there's lots of stuff going on. So it was a fun research. In 68 was a blast. That was the year the Beatles broke up, anyway, tons of great stuff. Simon Garfunkel were new. And I'm old enough I can remember 68 a little bit too. So, and of course, Vietnam, the protests, the war protests, and just the hard line that our country took against protesters. I mean, when at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, John Daly sent the cops out, or maybe the National Guard, I don't know who, but he told them to bust their heads, and they're clubbing guys. And I think that the poll I read about that, like 75% of the Americans thought that was the right thing to do. I mean, these peace freaks, these hippies, they were really truly a counterculture. So anyway, so that stuff's all swirling in my head, all this stuff of the 60s, and thinking about a kid, and I wanted the draft to be looming for that. Because how could you have been? I mean, the draft lottery was in place when I was in high school, and I remember that kind of gloom about what's going to, my future's in this random draw. Yeah. So I wanted that character to be on the brink where he has to confront, I could go to war, and what would I do, and then try to find a way to build in all that turmoil from the 60s without making the story too clunky, but just kind of representing the time. So really kind of a home front story more than a war story, but what's going on at home while these poor guys are over in Vietnam. So anyway, I start writing, I've done my research. I spent a year probably doing stuff, reading and killing time, playing solitaire on my computer and trying to get writing done. And finally I just had to start. And the first page was, typical first draft, not very good, but I thought I'm going to set it where I know. So my hometown in Arizona, even my own high school. So just the lay of the land was very familiar. And I had the research for the times, the climate of the times. So anyway, 3 or 4 chapters in, I'm bored stiff and thinking, this is a nightmare. This book's, it's a doomed project. It's dead on arrival, and there's not even an arrival date. It's partially dead. But so I tried everything I could to break free, and I just couldn't figure it out, And so I woke up one morning, it's about 4 o'clock, staring at the ceiling and thinking about this stupid book and what am I going to do? And what have I got that I even like about it? I thought, well, I like that the kid's 17 because the draft is just hanging over him like a sword. Yeah. So there's that. I had him born on May 17th because that's the Brown versus Board of Education date. And these are unintentional coincidences, but his dad played college football, wore the number 17. And so in retrospect, I thought, hey, there's a cool prime number that's floating around here. What about that? And And I knew that when you're thinking about a number, when you should be writing words, it's a great distraction, right? Get the calculator out, quit typing. And so I thought, okay, well, what can I do with 17, you know? And the summer before I was trying to do this writing in the Century to Writing Project, Pride and Prejudice and Zombies came up, this novel book, and we were laughing about it and with the teachers, and I looked up at other zombie books. This was before that zombie TV shows. I can't remember now.
The Walking Dead
Walking
is
Dead,
out in
yeah,
full force, yeah.
So there was actually one book called Zombie Haiku, and it was very much up my line of adolescent humor, male adolescent humor. It's gross. The pages were blood splattered with hair on them, and there was even a video to accompany it where the kid, he's a zombie, stomping through the neighborhood, dragging one leg, you know, and he's eating somebody's flesh and he stops and recites a haiku, you know, and so just kind of this weird, campy humor. And I thought, I wonder if I could write a zombie haiku, because there's the haiku, the nice framework to work with, but then to bring in a zombie, you know, zombic details, it'd be fun to match that up, and not to be gross, but to be clever was my goal, like to play with words and stuff. And so I sent one out at lunch to the teachers, and they all snickered, you know, and I thought, okay, this is kind of fun to have an audience. And so every day I'd write zombie haiku, or whatever time we had to write in reaction to something, I'd write a zombie haiku. And so after it was done, I realized that the haiku, writing these haiku, was really a kind of a creative warm-up, because it's like having a tiny pad of paper and have to draw something to fit in that little square. So I had to think about words and syntax and double meaning and all that kind of stuff, and then think of something zombie that could work in there too. So for like 4 or 5 months, every morning at 5 o'clock, these teachers got a zombie haiku from me that had in the subject line, "A haiku a day keeps the zombies away." And it was just fun to keep going, you know. And for people's birthdays, I would get commissioned, not for money, but to write a haiku to celebrate the birthday. So I mean, my favorite one was I can't remember exactly, but it's something like, "Hungry zombies crave brains. No, dyslexic zombies crave brains, but relentlessly stalk Bryans instead," which is just fun, that wordplay. Anyway, so I've been doing that, you know. And so here I am that morning trying to think about the stupid book, and I'm thinking, oh, haiku has 17. That's another prime number. So what could I do with that? And I thought, well, maybe the main character can write a haiku to his girlfriend, or maybe there's an epigraph at the beginning of each chapter that's a haiku, or maybe the book has 17 portions, 17 sections that are segmented in some way. And you know, I was desperate, and then I thought, what about 68? You know, 17 divides into 68 4 times. What about 1968? Is it divisible? So I have to get out of bed for that one to get my phone, and it's not divisible. And I thought, well, so if it had been, like, so what? But then I thought about the death count, 16,592, 16,592. Is that divisible by 17? So I punched it in, and it's 976. And I thought, wow, what could I do with that? You know, nothing is what I thought initially, but it's an interesting coincidence. But the more I thought about it, the more I wondered, maybe I could find a way to frame this narrative with all the historical stuff mingled in around haiku in some way. And I ultimately thought, what if I write the entire book, if the entire book is contained by that syllable count of 16,592, so there'd be exactly 976 haiku stanzas that tell this novel. And I was really excited by the prospect, and wrote a few chapters and sent it to my agent and said, what do you think? You know, and so she wrote back and said, well, you'd have to be able to count to 17 on a regular basis. And she pointed out that there were several pages of haiku that were 19 or 14, or that's all over the map. And I said, okay, but if I can count to 17 consistently, what do you think? And so she said what agents should say. She said, well, go ahead and write the whole thing. Let's see. You know, and so there's no promise. And but man, it was like being unleashed creatively. I was so energized, and I was counting all the time, you know, while I was writing. And but it was just the challenge of trying to frame it, and especially because it wasn't a gimmick, it was organic. That there's a reason it's in haiku. There's not just because I felt like writing haiku, but because of this count.
Right.
Each syllable is a memorial to another soldier. So I really liked that. So when I was done, you know, there was some editing to do, and then she started sending it around. I had the quickest rejection I've ever had. One editor got it like at midday, and the next morning it was rejected. Which in some ways is nice to not be wondering what's going to happen to this. But
yeah,
I think it's so fast to read, right? It didn't take her long to read 9,000 or 976 haiku stanzas. So
I thought about a sequel, because there are some open-ended, you know, he ends up in the novel, he's at the Hamburger Hill waiting, the worst battle in 69, the most bloodiest battle in 1969, waiting for the battle to begin. And then the book ends, you know, partly because I ran out of syllables. But I thought it was a nice ending to have this open-endedness, because from my research, I realized that there are still guys today who are missing in action. The family still don't know what happened to their sons, their brothers, husbands. And so to have the reader go through that experience of not knowing what happens paralleled the experience of a lot of people in that era. So, but there was no reason to write a sequel in haiku, right? Or I even tried tanka, you know, the expanded haiku, the Japanese tanka, but there was no reason for it. And so maybe a verse novel, and so I'm kind of working on a verse novel form that's free verse, but just because I like writing a verse, but to have a concrete form like a haiku or tanka, there wasn't a reason for it. So anyway, that's a long answer to your question.
Well, it's a perfect answer to the question, because for me, again, it works both ways, and our conversation is, you know, connected to the social studies and how we neglect it in the English class, right? We kind of give lip service to to that, but there's some real reminders of how important historical events can be. And I think if we can ingrain the significance of historical events, then our students and our current teachers might look more closely at the events that are happening around them now and say, how are they history? How are they shaping? You know, there could be some imaginary work done with history as well. But, you know, you and I are age enough apart that my year was the last year to draw numbers, but no one was drafted from 55. So I was born in 55, had a number that was 15.
Wow.
Had there been pulled, there's very little escape for the first 60 or 80 numbers, I think, you know, even with the college deferment. So some of us live that with neighbors going to Vietnam, or siblings of our best friends were going to Vietnam, and you know, and not everyone came back, and we were all acutely aware of that is happening. And people forget that it was the first war where reporters were embedded, and we saw on the news, you know, that very the battles that were going on, or the people trumping through the jungles. I had a colleague that I met at a NEH seminar who was in Vietnam in '66, and he came home, went to college, and forgot all about it until that documentary on PBS. Remember the one about the Vietnam years?
Oh, yeah.
And he says, I was watching it, and I saw this big, blonde, 6'3" kid walking across the river, and he says, it wasn't anybody, it was me.
Wow.
He said, I had this big machine gun on my shoulders, shirt off, bandolier, and he says, as soon as the show was over, I went immediately to counseling. He said, I went immediately and found a group. He says, because I hadn't he said he hadn't realized how he had put memories behind him. He just had not thought about it. Because when you come back in '66, no one wants to talk to you about a war hero. No one wants to talk. It's really fomenting in '67 and '68, as you said. So he said, I just forgot about it. Went to college, started teaching. And then, you know, 20 years later, you see yourself on TV and you went, oh, my word, what have I done?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And he said, and he's written a Vietnam novel as well since then. I should dig it up and send it to you. You know, we can cut that part out. But it's one of those things. He says, I just really didn't realize how thoroughly I had tamped down all that.
It's amazing.
And then it comes back. So I think as we're interested in current events and past events, I think your books really show, in my opinion, how the past can be really valuable in a classroom. You know, to take that moment of Emmett Till and look at the events that are surrounding it, to take death coming up the hill and look at the events that are surrounding it, are really, I think, interesting notions. So any other projects? You say you're dabbling with a novel in verse again. Do you share the topic, or where are you going with the next project?
So I've got a few things I'm working on. That novel project is sort of in limbo right now. I've not finished it, but the title I've been working with is just calling it Lottery, and you know, the draft lottery. And my focus is what happens is not on the soldier, but on the people who knew the soldier who's missing in action, and even casual acquaintances. And so I use all the character names from the Lottery, the short story, Shirley Jackson's short story, but it's kind of based on Spoon River Anthology, where there's these voices from the community who are speaking in verse, and some were intimately acquainted with the soldier who's missing, and some casually just kind of knew him, or he was just the guy in the store or something. So we're trying to imagine, what was it, you know, what's left behind when someone doesn't come home. And in Spoon River Anthology, nobody speaks more than once, but in this one, you know, the characters come up more than once. It's been a fun project, but organizing it's kind of like, how do I all these multiple voices? So
multi-voice novels could be tricky, right?
yeah, for me. So the other project, the thing I'm actually writing right now is a nonfiction, middle grade nonfiction. It's a rewrite of a pet project I've been working on for more than 20 years. A British kid from from London, 1806, I think, when he left. He signed on with the privateer, was marooned in Tonga after about a year. The Tongans attacked the ship, murdered most of the crew, and burned it. And so he's stranded on 10,000 miles from home on this island where he was 16 by then, and the king sort of adopted him. And he introduced not intentionally, but accidentally, the concept of reading and writing to Tongan culture, which was a Stone Age culture at the time. It was a great adventure story. I mean,
Yeah.
But just the time of Tonga was. So I'm trying to get that right. I haven't been able to. I think I have too much knowledge of this stuff, and so I can't resist throwing everything in, and there's no plot. It's just boring.
Yeah.
And I
Well,
think I mentioned to you earlier a short story anthology called The Grief Club that I've invited. So I'm still waiting for a publisher to give a green light on that, but invited several really great writers to contribute a story about some way connected to grief, including the challenge of trying to make it funny. Can you write a funny story? I'll see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen with that, but I'd love to.
That's I think something that's timely. Michelle Falter and I had those two books that came out about essentially about grief
in the classroom.
And how to talk about it without ignoring it, right? Even as something as simple as Romeo and Juliet. We often talk about Romeo and Juliet like it's this great read, but it's a really devastating story about suicide, and it becomes we gloss over it like it's not an issue. And I think often we've probably been teaching that book unaware of what it may be doing to students because we haven't talked about something